You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 459 of the podcast. And in this one, I got on Nicole Morris. Nicole is a therapist and host of the OCD Family podcast. We discuss her therapy story, her view of OCD, Inference-Based CBT, or I-CBT for short, and exposure response prevention therapy. And we talk about when she would use these and which one she would use first. We talk about her podcast, her favourite guests, words of hope, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to Nicole for her time. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot. Wherever you are, I hope you're doing well. And without further ado, here is Nicole. Welcome to the podcast, Nicole.
Well, thank you, Stuart. It is a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. So it'd be good to hear your therapy story. Like, what got you into being a therapist for OCD?
You know what's funny is, so growing up, I was always kind of pre-med track minded. And so I kind of had these views about therapy that it was a softer science, and not to say it's not important, y'all. I'm a therapist now, so I believe, I believe, but it was something where I just felt, as I kind of toured the different graduate school programs and went through and sorted through that, the marriage and family therapy program, which is, very, very clinical in nature, was the right fit for me. And so I went into therapy, and actually was a therapist for about 20 years before I got my first OCD client that I knew of. And so it was interesting because my little joke here is that this person presented with OCD so heightened and so extreme that even I couldn't miss it, because I realized once I learned about OCD, oh my goodness, I've missed this many times throughout the years. But I thought of this as generalized anxiety. It likes to be a fellow traveler with other disorders. So I would think trauma, I would think all sorts of different things. And so it was one of those things where I came to OCD. I looked into what is the treatment for OCD. I learned about this thing called ERP, exposure and response prevention, which I'm sure that your listeners are very familiar with. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. So I went back to the client and I said, I'm confident that you have OCD. I'm confident that I don't know how to do the treatment, and I'm confident that it needs to be this treatment. So let me help you get linked to somebody that knows how to do this. And at the time, the pandemic was really starting to flare up. This was probably April 2020. So it's like, shutdowns all over the world. And they were like, I don't care if you treat it or not. Like, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Please do not, let us go to another therapist. Waiting lists are really starting to build up, etc. And so I, as a person with lived experience of OCD myself, at the time not realizing that that was OCD, just having a special skill in anxiety myself, I was like, okay, here, I'll make a deal with you. We're going to try this. But if I really am not getting it, and because I can guarantee you I've never done this treatment before, then I really feel an ethical need to pair you with somebody that does get it, because you deserve better than that. And so we learned along and together, and I fell in love with working with OCD. And so it started that way. And because of COVID, so many of the trainings that you have to be able to travel to, and they have lots of costs, right? They're expensive, and hotel costs and food costs and all this. everything went virtual. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start learning and figure out what I can do. And so that's how my journey started in OCD. I ended up getting approached by OCD Midwest, which is an affiliate of the International OCD Foundation. And they sponsored me to be BTTI trained, which is the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute. And so gradually I didn't go out and say, hey, I specialize in OCD. And I live in a region where there are not OCD specialists around, even though there's plenty of OCD. And so it was one of those things where word of mouth, I just started getting more and more clientele saying, hey, I've heard maybe you can help with this. And so now the majority of my caseload is OCD. But that's how I got started with treating OCD. It was 20 years into my career going, oh, I've treated this my whole career. I just didn't realize it went by this name.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I'm glad you took to it and did the training, and here you are. So let's talk about your work as a therapist before we discuss the podcast.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess some real general questions like I just want to ask, like, what's your view of OCD? I know that's super generic. I just wanted to see how you view OCD.
Well, OCD, the monster of an animal that it is, it really depends on what lens I'm looking at it through. So if I am looking from a behavioral lens, from a more traditional exposure and response prevention lens, I look at it as this cycle of we have this intrusive thought that brings up a good amount of distress because it's unwanted. It's haunting in a lot of cases. Sometimes it can be disgusting, but a lot of times it's anxiety based. And that leads people naturally to a place where they go, oh, I don't like this. I don't want to feel this. That was a scary thought. Maybe it was an image, maybe it was a sound. And so I'm going to do something protective for myself, something that we might call a safety behavior, which is another word that I will use often for compulsions, right? And it starts off very honestly for people. If you had a thought that maybe you could do something that would bring harm to your child, wouldn't you want to protect your baby? I mean, we're both parents, Stuart. We're gonna protect our children, right? And so you start by maybe trying to mitigate that risk or minimize that risk or obliterate that risk or avoid anything that could bring that risk around. And so we have these different reactions. Sometimes they're going to be a physical act, a behavioral act. Sometimes they're going to be a mental ritual or act where we think, okay, if I really think about this and I can solve this, then this big bad thing won't happen. That brings around a little bit of temporary relief. We go, that feels better. It doesn't. There's plenty of people listening, I'm sure, that are like, hey, you know what? I do it, and it's actually incredibly distressing to do these different acts to try and help myself cope and survive this intrusive thought, this intrusive image. However, the thought of not doing it is even more distressing. And so sometimes it doesn't bring any relief at all. Sometimes it's very distressing. Sometimes people avoid doing something just to not get caught in a compulsive loop because it's that distressing. But the thought of not doing it attached to the meaning, the consequence, the distress with this intrusive thought is too grave. And so if that absolves any of the threat, any of the fear at the time, any of the disgust at the time, then it's very, very temporary. Because what we know about OCD is it's not that we just have kind of these whirlwind little spirals of a thought, but that it returns and it sticks. And you probably heard, or people tuning in may have heard about these kind of sticky thoughts. So that is a very, a very kind of somewhat straightforward understanding of when I'm sitting with a client and I'm saying, this is how OCD behaves. And when we look at this behavior, what is so powerful about an intervention like exposure and response prevention is that we can go in and we can expose, which is really scary sounding to a lot of people, right? Yeah. But we expose ourselves to the distressing thing, the triggering thought, the idea, the image, right? The core fear, ultimately, hopefully, is what we're exposing ourselves to. Um, and what happens then is we practice the response prevention. And if it was as easy as just saying, I am not going to do my safety behavior or a compulsion, because that's what response prevention is. It's preventing the response that we've been doing. It sounds very, very scary. And if we could just do that on our own, we wouldn't have OCD and we wouldn't need help there. And so recognizing that that is so hard. As a therapist, I have the honor of sitting with people and going, okay, so we're going to practice these exposures and we're not going to force ourselves to do something. I'm not going to force you to do it, but I'm going to do it with you. And we're gonna take on OCD, because part of what we know from exposure and response prevention is if we prevent this response, it actually unsticks these thoughts, it unsticks the learning, and it reshapes the learning around this thing here, this thought here, this image here, really being the threat we thought it was. And really, it was just an idea, it was a thought. And we have lots of thoughts in a day. They're not all ours, right? And we have lots of thoughts that we're able to dismiss. And so doing the different behavioral response learning, we don't have to do anything. And even more from kind of an ACT standpoint, we can go live our value-driven life. Our value-driven life isn't to constantly be like spidey sense, making sure we're mitigating ourselves from harm. Our value-driven life is going to the park with the kids, is being able to engage in the activities we enjoy. So from an ERP behavioral standpoint, that's how I understand OCD to be. But what I've learned over time, and actually, before I get into the other way I conceptualize it, any questions there, Stuart?
No, that was a really good description. Yeah, thank you. Keep going.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you. You're an affirmation station here, and I appreciate it. And so that's one way of looking at how OCD functions, right? Function is a pretty important word there. And it's something that if you've ever done treatment, you learn about kind of the function, because a lot of people get pulled into the content of the obsessions. Understandably, it's very scary. It's very dire. It feels very distressing or intrusive, as we've talked about. But OCD is actually a pretty formulaic, routined monster, and we can get its playbook. And so its playbook, from a behavioral standpoint and behavioral learning standpoint, ERP is such a great choice, and it's an awesome evidence-based practice. The other way that I've come to learn about OCD is from an inference-based CBT process. And if you've been in the field really for the last couple years, and I'll credit I-CBT, another way of referring to inference-based CBT, has been around for like 30 years. But if you've been around the field in the last handful of years, there's been more of a buzz, because more people, especially therapists at a grassroots level, have started learning more about I-CBT and going, holy crap, this is another way of thinking about OCD. So something that I will tell my clients is, I want you to imagine an animal. You can pick an animal, but for sake of illustration, I'm going to pick an elephant. If you look and you weren't sure what this elephant was, if you look at the elephant head on, you're going to see what? These floppy ears, you're going to see this trunk, you're going to kind of see a presentation, you'll see the eyes, all of that. If you look at the elephant from the backside, you're going to probably see this very big animal. You're going to see a tail maybe wagging, hopefully happy, and all the things, right? But it's going to look categorically different. So which one is the elephant? Well, both are the elephant. But if you're not familiar with the elephant, it's going to look very, very different the way you look at it. And so I use that analogy to say, well, first of all, I just think an analogy. So bear with me, folks. You might hear quite a few analogies through our time together. But if we look at the back of the elephant, it's going to be so different. And so I-CBT looks at that same OCD monster from a completely different vantage point. And it's looking at really the reasoning process, the cognitive process, as to how OCD develops. And so if we think of, we just went through the intrusive thought somewhat spiral. In I-CBT, we actually we look at an obsessional sequence, and we look at how we could have that same trigger. We could have that idea. What if some harm could come to my kiddo? That's what we talked about in the other example. And so how are we looking at OCD from this different vantage point? Well, we have a trigger that leads to a doubt. Another word for inference is that we use often is doubt, which is different than an intrusion. An intrusion is something that we can think about and it doesn't feel good and great. Yeah, I get that. But the doubt is different because it is really a reasoning process where we've constructed an idea, and not just the idea, but a conclusion about that idea that feels very scary. What if I could harm my child? That is different than just an intrusive thought. That's a conclusion about this idea that I could be a harmful person, and that, oh, even worse, I could harm one of the people most precious to me in my life. And so what happens next is we get this really like meaningful, yucky kind of consequence from the doubt, from this conclusion we've come to. And we say, oh, well, that would be the worst. I would never want anything to happen to my kid. But also, like, what kind of person does that? Am I a monster? You can see how the distress starts to build. And then we have compulsions, right? So if I could be a monster that could harm my kid, maybe I shouldn't be left alone with my kid. Maybe I need to make sure that my partner is there. Or maybe we should lock up all the knives because I don't know what I could do. And I would hate to think, shudder to think, that I could ever hurt my kid. But since I had this thought, maybe I don't realize what I'm capable of. And so you can see how all of these compulsions then can again respond because this doubt occurred in the first place. So what we do in I-CBT is we say, okay, so if I have this trigger and I came to this conclusion, a reasoning process where I had an inference and I came to this idea, then if I can address how I came to that conclusion, then, and I can resolve the reasoning error that is happening there, then does the whole rest of the sequence even happen? If I know and I can trust myself that I actually am safe around my children, and not only that, but I'm mama bear, and if anybody dared even try to hurt them, I'd be the first to be like, step up off, going into fight, flight, or freeze, but I would protect my babies, right? If I can trust myself, if I can know that actually I came to this conclusion, I reasoned it. It wasn't just an intrusive thought, but it was a conclusion. What if I'm a dangerous person? What if I could get neglected a detail? What if I'm a monster? Whatever the thing is. Then if we resolve that, none of this over here happens. And how do I know? Because if we look in areas where we don't, anybody with OCD knows there's certain things that pop up for us. But if we look just kind of across the broad spectrum of human experiences, we don't get pulled into all things like this, right? I'm not like, what if I go bomb part of the city today? And why not? Why am I not worrying about that, right? Because in many ways, it's kind of similar to saying, what if I were to harm my children? If I know my sense of self, I know my real self, I can read my internal sense data, I can trust the direct evidence in my here and now, I know that that's not going to happen. I came to that conclusion. I reasoned myself to a place where I imagined it's possible. And this is a huge thing for anybody with OCD because possibility. Whew, the things that are possible can really, really disarm us, can immobilize us, right? But the reality is there's a lot of things in this world that are possible that we don't worry about. And so we learn in I-CBT about how we come to these reasoning processes, and that it's not a fluke. It's not random. There are a reason why it's these processes and not other processes. And if we can resolve that and start to see kind of the trick, the illusion, the con there that OCD pulls, then we don't get so tripped up in it. Now, our brain is still going to have OCD, so our brain is going to brain. Every now and then we might get pulled in, right? That happens if whether you're doing ERP, whether you're doing I-CBT, anything else. But at the same time, we learn and can really kind of get ourselves out of what we call in I-CBT land, the OCD bubble. We can kind of pop that bubble and go, I got absorbed into that story right there. But actually, I'm back here. I'm in the present. I'm able to trust myself, and I'm going to just go on and live my life. And so when I think about how OCD is constructed, a kind of simplified, maybe oversimplified way of thinking about it is, what we think about leads to the action or the thoughts, the rituals, what we do, right? And so if we change the way we think, we don't even have to do something like target compulsions because we're not going to do that if the threat's not there. I'm not sitting there like going, now how do I not bomb town hall today? I don't have to do any compulsion or any kind of response prevention around that because I'm not going to do that. It doesn't matter, right? And so these are the two ways that I think about it. We can think things, and that ultimately is going to impact what we do, or we can target the things we're doing, and through doing something else like response prevention, it's going to change the way that we conceptualize or think about it. And so those are kind of the two different ways of looking at this elephant. And both are super awesome because they bring a lot of hope and relief and recovery to people. And so those are, more or less little bit of a trail there, Stuart, but those are the ways I think about OCD.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really good description of I-CBT. And how do you balance, like, when do I do ERP as a therapist with my client and when do I do I-CBT? How are you sort of making that judgment call?
That is such a great question. And guess what? I don't make the judgment call. I let them choose. I let people choose. I present every single time both strategies, both evidence-based practices. My thing is I don't want to waste people's time and they've been suffering long enough, right? And I also don't want them to feel like tethered to me as a therapist and I will only be okay or better as long as I have Nicole in my life. A lot of people come into me going, but you're the only one that does OCD here. You're the only one that can help. And I want them to leave empowered going, actually, I'm pretty skilled and amazing at doing my life on my own. And I can appreciate Nicole, but I don't have to feel stuck and tethered to her. And so because everyone's brain is going to operate a little bit differently, or maybe even they've had past experiences with therapy, they might lean toward one approach or the other. And so what I do is I say, listen, there's this elephant, there's this monster, right? Here are the two ways we can look at it. What feels like it makes sense to you? What feels like it fits better to you? And you let me know because I love them both. And I think both are amazing. So let's do what feels right to you. And I let them choose because ultimately I can go, oh, I really like these aspects of ERP and it's really unique to ERP. Or I really like these aspects of I-CBT and it's really unique to I-CBT. And because they're going from these different sides of the animal, they're really not. Sometimes people will go, well, I'm going to integrate them. Okay, well, you integrate in the middle. And if you think about it from the cognitive perspective, we never get to the middle because we fix the reasoning error and we never get there. Or we've worked backwards the other way. And so I say, whatever feels right to you, and let's do this. And so I will give them the choice. If it's a child, we'll do a PSI box. If it's an adult, we'll do a Y box. So those are the Yale Brown obsessive compulsive scales, PSI just being the child Yale Brown. And so that gives us a really good idea of how loud their OCD, how severe, how much time on their day it's taking up, how it's impacting their functioning. And then I'll also do something called the Inferential Confusion Questionnaire, even if they don't choose I-CBT, because what we've come to learn is one of the mechanisms that is happening within OCD is something called inferential confusion. And so even if we're not attacking the elephant from that side. I want to know again, how much inferential confusion is there going on? Because it's another data point and another measure I can use to say, are we making progress? Are we struggling? Where are we at? And so I let them choose, and I'm happy to go along with whatever feels like it fits with them. But what I will say is when I first started doing OCD treatment and I learned it and I got BTTI trained, everything was ERP. And I love ERP, but it's not a cure. I love I-CBT, but it's not a cure, right? And so people coming in feeling hopeless, feeling distraught, feeling absolutely just in pain and scared and saying, okay, so there's this thing called ERP, which was great. I'm so grateful that I know how to do it. I'm so grateful for all the amazing research and work that's been done to help it improve over the years and just continue to grow and get better. But people are like, that's my only option. And I'd be like, yeah, then I can tell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I as a person with lived experience OCD, the more I learned about it, went, oh, well, talk therapy doesn't really help OCD. And I think I've been doing talk therapy, and now I have this hyper responsibility to do this well. And yes, ERP is the only option. And so it was really hard because people were like, I don't know if I can do that. Now, of course, a lot of them did do it, and they had amazing results for the most part. But the idea of, gosh, there's only one option. It's like going to a restaurant and being like, there's only a burger. What if I can't do the burger? No chicken, no this, no that. No, this is the burger. But guess what? You can learn to eat the burger. I believe you can do the burger. And you're like, okay. And so as a person, even myself, who has done ERP myself and I-CBT myself, I can really feel the differences, and I'm super grateful for both. But having options, I think, if anything, no matter which one people choose, helps them go, oh my gosh, I don't feel like, because of course, us positive OCD thinkers, we're like, what if that doesn't work for me? Right? If I only have one option, what if it doesn't work for me? It already feels like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be the one. And they say it works, but I'm going to be the one it doesn't work for because we're super optimists. Now, I'm making a little joke there, OCD folks, because again, as a lived experience, I know. Um, I just know how cruel the brain can be around these things because you'll probably be the one that it doesn't work for. You probably have the kind of OCD that's never been heard of. If you even have OCD, you know, enter any of those kind of thoughts. So yeah, I let them choose.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, good one. And it's empowering them to to have the ownership of their recovery. And then you can always do the next one if the first one doesn't work, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what, Stuart, to that point, I will have people and then they're so desperate for hope. And so I empathize and I've been there that sometimes we'll start one and they're like, well, let's go to the other way. I don't know about this one, actually. Let's just hop. And so something that I'm mindful of is when we pick one, let's give it a real honest try. And because if we feel anxiety, like, what if this isn't working? What if I pick the wrong one? What if, fill in the blank? And we haven't given it an honest try yet, then we're not doing the model justice, and we never really kind of got into the meat of it where it works. So I do give also people that informed consent. I say, we can always try the other one, but if we're choosing ERP, I want us to get through that psychoed. I want us to create our hierarchies. I want us to give it some shots, right? And not just one trial or just one type of exposure. And, oh, that was hard. Let's jump ship to I-CBT. Let's really try to do it. Because the power in ERP, as we know, is as we kind of go into it, we put more practice into it, something kind of clicks, right? And we go, oh, I was anxious and I was afraid this thing was going to happen, and then it didn't happen. Even in cases when bad things do happen, my OCD was kind of right. It was never to the scale that I thought it was going to be. And wow, if that worked here, I'm ready. I'm excited to try this here with this intrusion, with this trigger. And so we really want to give it an honest try. But yes, if we're in treatment for 6 months, and I'm just randomly, I'm not even saying it has to be 6 months, or it could be longer. And we're going, I have really tried And it's just a stuck point, and I cannot get past it. Instead of going, oh, that's too bad. I guess you're one of the people that ERP didn't work for, or I-CBT, pick one.
Yeah.
Then we go, well, you know what? We do actually have this other option. And because it attacks this animal from a different direction, that's a beautiful thing because we know this direction isn't so helpful.
Yeah.
So let's go to that other direction. And so, yeah, you do have the option to switch. I'm a big fan and an advocate for like, let's hang with this option long enough to give it a fair, honest shot. And if it's just not working, absolutely. And that goes for ERP, that goes for I-CBT, for anything. So yeah, there are, but thank goodness for the option, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would personally throw in ACT in isolation as an option too, because
Yeah.
it's been studied as a sole treatment for OCD, and that never really gets talked about. Yeah, so I just want to throw that into the mix. The way I see it is when people say that, well, what happens if ERP doesn't work? Well, I'm like, well, one, it might be me as the therapist that's failed you, so try many others. It might be there's I-CBT, there's ACT, metacognitive therapy. It's not my thing, but there's a ton of therapies. Just because there's not even an evidence base, you can't say you've tried everything, or because we don't know everything yet. There's a ton of therapies that we don't have an evidence base for. Doesn't mean they don't work.
Such a great point. Such a great point. I mean, and the thing is, yes, absolutely. We need to let ACT, have its place in all of this. And honestly, I feel like I infuse ACT into so much that it's hard to separate out for me at this point, probably because I've kind of just added it in so much. It's so present in a lot of what I do. But you're right, in isolation too, it can function. I actually just for the podcast interviewed Dr. Pia Callison in Copenhagen, and she does so much amazing work with metacognitive therapy. And I'm like, great, another option that can work for OCD. It is when you are so used to doing ERP or I-CBT or anything else, it is so hard to sometimes zoom out and go, okay, let me try and understand OCD now from this standpoint, because that might be another perspective on the animal. Same animal, but now I'm a second profile view, and I have to go like, okay, so how do I wrap my brain around this? But as long as we don't have a cure, we need to be open to there is more that can be learned. And even when we do have a cure, we think about certain things like diseases that used to be real problematic in the past and have pretty much been obliterated because certain vaccines or whatever. And I'm not trying to make it into a vaccine debate by any means. But when we think about it, it's not that the things are now extinct, because things can evolve. And so it's really required treatment, whether it's medicine, mental health, to evolve as well. And so we need to always be open to evolving, because OCD, something I can tell y'all about OCD is it's evolving in real time all the time. It is a shapeshifter. It can morph into this thought or this idea or this fear or this doubt or this conclusion. And it's super important to be able to kind of zoom out again and go, okay, evidence-based is important, but also clinical and trusting your intuition is important. Yeah. And that's something I really actually like about I-CBT too, because part of what we learn in that is we've started to doubt things that we can see, hear, taste, feel. We've started to doubt common sense, not across the board and completely broadly, but in this obsessional content. And so we stopped trusting ourselves. And so when you can actually lean in and trust yourself, you can come up with ideas, even if it's not an evidence-based practice. It could be someday if you garnered and continued to focus and learn and study about this idea, right? We need ideas in and of themselves. Being creative, trusting our intuition is not a bad thing. And we need to not kind of just dismiss that, we have this idea, but you know what? It doesn't fit neatly into ERP or MCT, that being metacognitive therapy, or I-CBT. We need to be okay, especially even as clinicians. We've done a lot of work and training to get to this point. And so if we have an idea and we're like, you know what? I think there could be a connection that's really helpful here.
Hmm.
And you can tell your client, I don't know for sure, but I think this could be really helpful here. Trusting yourself and being able to kind of think through it, test it out. That's what the scientific method is anyway. We come up with different hypotheses. We test them. Do they work? It worked this time. Was that a fluke? Was it anecdotal and circumstantial? Or can we repeat that and that works over here? Oh my gosh, there might be something to this. And so, yeah, absolutely. We need to be willing and humble really in saying, even if we know some really really good strategies, there's still more strategies. My kind of analogy for this is there's more than one way to get to 4, right? We could go 4 plus 0, we could go 1 plus 3, we could go 5 minus 1, we could go 4 times 1, right?
2
And
plus 2.
there's 2 plus 2, exactly. And so sometimes we're like, but this is how we get to 4, and it's like, y'all, well, there's so many ways to get to 4.
Yeah.
And so let's not give up hope on that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also like there's many ways to climb. There's many ways you can climb Mount Everest, but right now there's certain trails that are a bit safer and more efficient. So we go on those ones more. But it doesn't mean you can't go straight up it in a straight line. You just might not be safe. All right.
Yeah. Or you might have to do some work to forge that path, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You may some parts of it might be very straightforward, and some parts of it might be like, how am I going to traverse this? Doesn't mean it can't be traversed. And it's wonderful. And we're so thankful for the paths that have been carved out and created, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, it doesn't mean there's no other options. People with OCD are some of the most creative, intelligent people I've ever met. And so going, well, we only have maybe 3 or 4 answers, if we're going ACT and ERP, I-CBT, MCT, just to name a couple. And you can only go these paths. Again, like, we're creative. We can come. People have figured out. They went outside. They saw this big bright white dot in the sky that kind of changes shapes and sometimes disappears altogether. And they figured out, I'm going to build something that goes there, not even knowing how many thousands of miles it was away, right? Talk about not having a path. Mount Everest, move over. We figured out how to leave this atmosphere and deal with new gravities. Our brains are creative and amazing. And so let's lean into that and allow room for some creative ideas about and solutions about how to solve these complex mental health disorders. Absolutely.
Yeah, spot on. So tell us about your podcast.
Well, thanks for asking, Stuart. My podcast is called the OCD Family Podcast, and it's available wherever you enjoy your podcasts and YouTube. So I created this podcast a couple years ago because, especially during the pandemic, I have a client still to this day, very dear to me, whose spouse was really, really struggling with OCD. And they happen to be my client. But in the region where I am, if someone is going to get treatment, it's typically the person suffering, the warrior suffering with OCD, right? And they were in their own way getting their treatment met by another provider. But I had this heart for the spouse going, this is so hard. And as we know, and we talk a lot about, we use words like family accommodation, we talk about the environment, how OCD can get gate kept in certain environments and can really flare when we move, go to college or kind of go out on our own, and OCD can kind of take over, right? Why? Because our environment can have such an impact on things. So this client happened to be one of the lucky ones that was having their own support, their own therapy. But during the pandemic, particularly, the wait lines were going up. People were losing insurance, which is more maybe a problem here in the US than over in the UK. But I'm sure providers were very strapped, right? And so if anyone was going to get help, it was going to be the warrior. And I love warriors, and I'm a warrior myself. So I think that is important. But because the environment has such an impact, because the family, because these relationships have such an impact, I really wanted a resource for them to be able to go and get help and feel less alone. They were getting help with me in therapy, but I wanted them to know you're not the only one. Oh my goodness. Like, I guarantee everybody out there struggling with OCD or OC related disorders, they have a family that is struggling with the impact of this in one way or another. And so I started looking for podcasts and audiobooks and different things because I knew that my person enjoyed that kind of media and content. It fit, it was functional in their life. And I just really couldn't find it. There are amazing podcasts, yours being one of them. Absolutely, right? And it's not that you guys never talk about the family, and you've had a number of people on, Dr. John Abramowitz, you've had John Hirschfield, you've had absolutely different warriors talking about their family experiences, but I just didn't have like a home base. Which to me kind of seemed funny because I was like, this is such a core part of treatment is working with the family and understanding the environment. And so that really led me to go, well, if it doesn't exist, I guess I'm going to make it. Because I know I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of treatment provider and practitioner friends, great colleagues, a very giving community here. If we can create some resources to let family, folks, loved ones, chosen family to know they're not alone, roommates, best friends, then I want to create that resource so that they have a place to gather and just go, oh my gosh, I so identify with that. Oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one, and be able to come together around that. So that led me to creating OCD Family Podcast, and we're in our third season now. I say we a lot. It's me running, like creating it, but also we, because it's the family. I just think of it even as a community resource. So I have the fortunate connections with different colleagues, etc., to be able to put together really good content that can be helpful. But also, I think that, it's not just about me. It's about people coming and sharing their stories, as you know, such a gift, and helping people know that they're not alone. That's the most important part, right?
100%.
They're not alone.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, and I'm glad you did it and created it specifically for the family and family dynamics. I guess all of our guests are important to us and special in their own way, of course, much like a parent talks about their children. I don't have a favorite, and I'm definitely not asking you for your favorite. I guess, is there one or a few guests that stick out for you that for you personally, it really shifted something for you in maybe how you treat OCD, think about OCD, or anything like that, or just moved you in a very deep way?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. Well, first, and this is going to sound cliche, but it's true. So I'm owning it, and I'm going to say it anyway. My son has been on the podcast.
Cool.
My son, who has lived experience of OCD, he's also autistic. He has ADHD, and he's amazing. And yes, I'm biased because he's my kid. But we've done ERP with him, and we've done I-CBT, which I will note, it kind of talks about forging those paths, right, with our Mount Everest example, because I-CBT hasn't been really studied and applied to that degree with kids. But I find if kids can tell the difference between imagination and reality, it can be really effective. And so something that's been really powerful for me, this is my work, right? But I have a vested interest in my son doing well, a vested in everybody, but there's that special attachment. And so hearing him be able to come on and so matter-of-factly be able to call OCD out and be like, when it had caused such incredible pain for him and impacted our family, has been one of the neatest things. So I've loved that because I'm so close. It's hard to it's hard to be objective, but I can hear in his story, like, it's beyond that. Like, he is at a subclinical level at this point. And boy, if when I was his age, could have been subclinical, realizing I was dealing with OCD and it didn't have to be that hard. It didn't have to be that bad. It didn't have to be that scary. That's amazing. So that's one that kind of sticks out for me. Another one that sticks out for me was really interesting. I talked with a guest. Let me think of her name, Dr. Melissa. Usually I can recall it. I'm going to look at my catalog here, but I had talked with her about the intersection of OCD and IBS and GI distress, right? Because a lot of our clients can have difficulty or have that kind of GI response with anxiety. And so it was Dr. Melissa Hunt, that's who it was. And so Dr. Melissa Hunt talked about actually there's more to this than you would realize. And she zoomed in. She's not specifically an OCD therapist. She's more of a generalist, but she studied under Dr. Edna Foa, and she certainly knows her business about OCD. And so Dr. Melissa was like a really cool kind of way of going, oh my gosh, some of these things that I would have never even thought about or attributed to. And when we know kind of on one level that we can kind of get some GI responses or struggle with things in that way. On one hand, like understanding the why, it's not as haphazard or like the link is a lot more concrete than we realized. That was a pretty cool episode.
Yeah, that does sound cool. Yeah, I'm glad you covered that. It's an important area. So look, I wanted to ask you, you got a billboard. What do you want on that billboard?
If I had a billboard, what would I want on a billboard? I think I would want, it doesn't have to be this painful. If I could even go back to, young version of myself, Nicole, and be like, you know what, all this fuss, all the whatever that you thought was just anxiety and would never, I learned I was a high functioning, high skilled person. I'm a therapist. I have tools out in my toolbox for sure. But I thought life couldn't be better than this certain kind of point that I've been able, and I worked really hard to create. And I'm proud of what I did, but realizing and kind of having the veil come off and go, it didn't have to be that hard. Like I would want people to know it's hard. If you're in pain, it doesn't have to be that painful, that there's hope, that it can be better. This is sometimes I've said this before. I've heard clients say this before. I feel like I've peaked. Everything's going to be downhill from now. Right. And right now the peak, it's not feeling really great. And it's like, actually, there is a lot of hope, and you're not the only one that's thought that. And we're better. We can strengthen and lean in and encourage each other on that. And so I think that's what I'd want people to know, because I think more than anything else, it may help them know they're not alone and they don't have to feel it that way.
No, really good point. And lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
Well, nothing that kind of comes off the top of my head. I can be verbose and pretty talky, so I might even turn the question around. Is there anything that you're glad that I didn't talk about? Because you get me going. My kids are away. Sometimes, as a mom, it can be like, gosh, having another adult to talk to. Right.
Yeah, it's nice.
And so, no, I think I've covered a lot of it, but listeners, I just want you to know there's so much hope. And Stuart, I also want to just say thank you to you for all the amazing work that you're doing and creating a platform, a space to hold these stories that are so important. Stories matter. In fact, from an I-CBT perspective, that's part of what's hard, because we can construct these stories about these conclusions that are so scary. But when we can reconnect to kind of our lived experience and in the present, it's such a beautiful and important thing. And so thank you for allowing space and holding space for people to share their stories. I'm so moved and such a fan of what you've created here. And just thank you for what you've done.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And obviously, thank you for your work, your podcast, and you sharing stories. It really, really matters from different voices as well. So thank you again for your time, expertise. It's been great chatting with you.
Yes, absolutely. It's been fun, Stuart.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD Stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.